Welcome to The Detail. I am your host, Kathy Antunes, and you are listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota, Florida, and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton, Florida. With me today is attorney Richard Grasso. He is a public interest and environmental and land use attorney who has worked on issues in Florida at the local, state, and federal level. The former legal director of 1,000 Friends of Florida, Mr. Grasso has been involved in the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan, the carrying capacity land use planning for the Florida Keys, and is also concerned with climate and sea level rise sustainability issues in South Florida. So, Mr. Grasso, Richard, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to chat about these issues.
Yes, I think that, when people move to Florida, and most of the time, most Floridians, new Floridians are from somewhere else, and they've been charmed by a very unique landscape. I think the Everglades, there's no other environment like it in the world. And we have a lot of unusual fauna and flora here. But if then you've lived here for any period of time, some of the pressure on the environment and the pressure caused by what many would call overdevelopment becomes clear. So let's just start here. You are representing, the reason you're on the show is you are representing plaintiffs in Sarasota County against the county decisions, some of these recent decisions for development. We'll get to that. But Richard, can you tell me what drew you to the work that you do, and how do you see this time right now when it comes to the future of Florida and Florida's development?
Sure. So I grew up and came of age in the 70s, the late 70s, in Miami, in Miami-Dade County, and went to college and law school in the early 80s and mid 80s. And so as I was growing up, that was just about when Florida, the mid 70s, was starting to become a mega state, when we really were feeling the big population boom and building boom in Florida. And it always got my attention as someone who cared about the outdoors and the outside and beaches and Everglades, just how quickly things were changing in the community, that I was growing up in. And it always intrigued me, who got to decide that that's getting built there? Who got to decide that piece of beach is no longer going to be open to the public and it's going to have huge hotels, in it? Who gets to decide that part of the Everglades is now going to be a suburb? And that decision-making process was what drew me into going into land use and environmental law. And then so I grew up in South Florida, and then I spent a lot of time in Tallahassee, went up there to college and law school, and the earlier part of my career as a lawyer in Tallahassee. And it came away from that experience having been throughout the state of Florida, from the Keys to the Panhandle and up to the northeast part of the state. Having spent a lot of time down in the Keys, I actually wound up marrying a conch from Key West.
Oh, wow.
And so I was very in tune to the major changes that were happening in our state, and was seeing firsthand some of the downsides of the great development boom. And we had things like parts of the Everglades catching on fire. We had water shortages. You started seeing, you couldn't go to the beach, or you couldn't go to a state park without it being really crowded, and starting to feel like, wow, this is not what the postcard looked like. This was not what is being promised to people to come to enjoy Florida. And starting seeing, rivers that I was canoeing in regularly being listed as polluted by the state of Florida. And it became clear to me early on as a young lawyer that these kinds of decisions about what was happening to our state number one, we're typically permanent, putting aside the odd chance we get every now and then to have a multi-billion-dollar restoration program like for the
Right.
Everglades.
Hmm.
By and large, when you're deciding to replace that part of natural Florida with development, that's a permanent decision. And it
Hmm.
also started to become clear to me that these decisions were not usually determined based on science and good public policy, but that the amount of money that was involved in these kinds of decisions really skewed the decision making by government, and
Hmm.
in a way that I thought was horrible. And so I decided early on that I was going to devote, my work as an attorney to trying to make sure that decisions about the future of my state were based on fact, science, and law, as opposed to, short-term economic or political considerations. And that's what's fueled what I do over the last 35 years as a lawyer.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we certainly, in my opinion, that kind of work is desperately needed. It's the short-term profit model versus the long-term health of the state and the environment. Um, we, at least I feel, it's the balance right now is toward the profit. Um, and yet the goose that lays the golden egg when it comes to Florida is the environment. It's what distinguishes Florida. Um, can you tell me a bit before we get into Sarasota County specifically? I'm curious about this Florida Keys carrying capacity work that you've done regarding land use planning. And I ask that because it sounds to me like it may be involved with determining that there is a limit, right, to what the land can manage, whether it's, handling waste, human waste really is a big deal in Florida. We're not, we're at sea level, and it's not like up north or more inland places where we have a lot of ground underneath, right? We're pretty fragile ecosystem. Maybe we start there, but even, traffic, roads. Um, so what is that carrying capacity land use planning?
Well, the law that gave rise to that is pretty much exactly the same law that is involved right now in the Lakewood Ranch project that we're opposing in eastern Sarasota County. It's Florida's land use planning law, which at its most fundamental has since 1985 has required the local governments write land use plans that are based on the availability of public facilities and services, and that are based on the character of the natural land,
Mm-hmm.
and that are based on the ability to safely evacuate people from hurricanes. And the first and most acute place where that law was applied with really strict results was the Florida Keys back in the late 90s, late 80s. The state had objected to the Monroe County Comprehensive Plan because it allowed way more development than its wastewater infrastructure could handle, or its stormwater infrastructure could handle. It allowed way more development than the evacuation capacity, just one road in and out of the Keys
Yeah,
could
right.
handle.
Mm-hmm.
It allowed more development than the natural forest, the natural habitats of the Keys could accommodate. And so, in kind of a groundbreaking decision that I, happened to have been involved with back when I was working with 1,000 Friends of Florida, the state required a complete rewrite of the comprehensive plan for the Keys, which was mostly dominated by Monroe County as a government back then. Since then, you've had cities pop up in Islamorada and in Marathon, but back then they were all part of Monroe County. And that plan had to be rewritten based on quote unquote carrying capacity, which is a shorthand phrase for the things I just described. A lot of people like to, poke fun at a phrase like carrying capacity. Oh, what does that mean? It basically means don't outstrip your infrastructure. It basically means don't allow more development than you can safely get off a barrier
Mm-hmm.
island when hurricanes are coming in. So the plan had to be rewritten based on the carrying capacity, the science, the infrastructure, the evacuation capacity. And it was determined then that once that analysis got done, that there really was a very finite amount of additional development that could occur in the Keys without resulting in very dangerous evacuation times
Mhm.
and without creating irreversible water quality problems in the Keys, the nearshore waters and the reef that define the Florida Keys, and without losing the tropical hardwood hammocks and other habitats that are home to more endangered species, I think, in one county than anywhere else in
Wow.
the United States.
Mhm.
And so that then resulted in the state deciding the only way that the Florida Keys can comply with this land use planning law is to strictly limit and cap a total cap of how much
Mm.
development can occur in the Florida Keys. And that number was arrived at mostly by a model for hurricane evacuation, because that's
Okay.
the kind of thing that you can put a number on. You can kind of objectively determine the
Well,
how much.
and people get that, right? I mean, it's very compelling politically. People understand what you're talking about.
Well, that's a really strong point. The science of how much more development can the waters handle and the habitat handle, that's more of a soft science. It's kind
Mhm.
of hard to put an exact figure. So it was agreed, because of the imperative of protecting life and limb during hurricanes and hurricanes approach, for the reasons you said, that
Mhm.
that number would serve as a proxy for all of the carrying capacity limits in the Keys. That's why
Mm.
we stuck on the hurricane evacuation number for the Florida Keys.
Mhm.
And so, that system, that limited rate of growth system, has existed in the Keys now since 1992. As an aside, we're still involved in legal challenges. The governor and cabinet a few years ago uh, busted those limits and granted
Mm.
1,800 additional permits over that 24-hour
Mm.
evacuation based limit, in response to arguments about workforce housing
I
in the
see.
Keys. And so
Mhm.
even that shining example of carrying capacity based planning in the Keys is still at risk from political decisions that don't want to come to terms with the fact, as you had said, there just really is a finite amount of land and
Mhm.
water in our narrow peninsular state
Yeah.
that we can handle.
Yeah.
But that said, while the carrying capacity limits in a place like the Keys are so much more obvious and acute, they exist everywhere else.
Well, so this is great. As you're describing the Florida Keys, because Sarasota County has these, barrier islands, right? And I think of them as nature's way of kind of softening the blow when a storm comes in. Those barrier islands are they take the first hit, you
That's why
know?
they're called barrier islands, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so you talked about 1992 being this red line for the Florida Keys, but people on Siesta Key kind of drew a line in the sand, pun intended, in 1989. And so, can you speak to that? I was able
Sure.
to listen into part of you. There recently was a hearing, and I'm speaking to the case that Lourdes Ramirez filed against Sarasota County. You're representing her, and this is claiming that the county has violated the comprehensive plan by approving mega hotel development, much larger hotels. But during that hearing, the year 1989 was referenced quite a bit, is when Siesta Key said you can't, they put a limit on development. What was that about, and why did they do that?
Sure. Actually, it goes as far back at least as 1981, where the county's land use comprehensive plan originally said that because of concerns about hurricane evacuation, the ability to safely evacuate so many people from the barrier islands, because they were, of the sensitive nature of coastal habitats, the plan since at least 1981 has said, um, we have got to limit development to what's allowed now. We cannot ever allow an increase in what you're allowed to build on the barrier islands because of the great concerns over hurricane evacuation and coastal natural resources. And that a policy like that has been in the Sarasota County comprehensive plans continuously since at least 1981.
And just so the audience knows, the comprehensive plan is kind of like the local Bible of land use. It's, underneath that you've got zoning, which is the particulars, but the comp plan really guides the overall philosophy and rules, right? For each county has one, and that's how they work.
Absolutely. They're required by statute. The courts in Florida have likened them to the Constitution.
Okay.
The comprehensive plan is the Constitution, and the zoning regulations are, the laws that implement that. They have to be consistent with and implement the plan. So that's exactly what it is. It's required. I mean, we wrote this law. The legislature wrote this law in order to make sure that all cities and counties were on the same page, that we were growing in the same way and in the same direction, and in a way that looked out for these overall state objectives. For example, everybody evacuating from my county impacts the safe evacuation of people in surrounding counties.
And you're in Broward County?
Right. For example, I live in Broward County, and so the amount of development Broward County allows impacts the ability of people in Dade County and in the Keys to evacuate safely. The amount of development that is allowed in Sarasota County impacts the evacuation of people who don't live and vote in Sarasota County. That was one of the primary reasons for this law. But and so, consistent with the law's requirements, Sarasota County had this really strict limitation on barrier island development, not intensifying the land uses compared to what they had been. And as of 1989, the comprehensive plan that was rewritten to comply with the new statutory requirements, our analysis made pretty clear that although the rules were not that clear, at the most you could build 36 hotel rooms an acre on Siesta Key. At the least, you weren't allowed to build hotel rooms at all on Siesta Key, because the 1981 comprehensive plan, had said we have problems with evacuation and coastal resources. We don't want to, or we are not going to allow an increase in development. And as of the time of the 1981 comprehensive plan, when that plan said that, the greatest density allowed anywhere on barrier islands was 36 hotel rooms an acre.
And isn't it true? It's my understanding that there hasn't been a lot of new hotel development on Siesta Key. Like, didn't they even cap the number of hotels? Am I right on that?
Well, they capped the number of hotels based on the language that I'm talking about. You're not allowed to build any more than you're allowed, back in 1981 already, which number was either 36, depending on how you interpret one of the ordinances. Maybe it was 26, and we think this is the most accurate reading. The 1981 comprehensive plan froze density no more than what's already allowed, which would have been 36 at its highest. And the 1981 comprehensive plan encouraged downzoning of barrier islands. So along came an ordinance in 1983 that the county adopted, where it established what the allowable number of hotel rooms were in certain areas, and it had a map, and barrier islands weren't on that map. And that brings us to the big point of debate in the mega hotel case. The hotel applicants and the county lawyers are now arguing, well, what that meant was the county meant there to be no limitations.
Yeah, so we've got to stop a second. I want to describe this to people who are listening. This was a map, like I live in the city of Sarasota, and the cities, that's where you have density, right? That's where you put your high-rise buildings and, multifamily dwellings. I live in a condominium. It's only 7 stories high. But cities, so this map, when I was watching the hearing, and I really kind of laughed because this map around the cities of like Venice and Sarasota and Northport, there's a red zone, which is the most density. And then it becomes progressively orange, yellow to, for lower densities. And then out in the pasture land at that time, but hopefully now, right? We still have farms. Then there are these green areas. And so that was where you were, I think a common sense reading is that was low density, right? They're not part of these high density. And so that included all the Keys, all the barrier islands, and the lands east of I-75. So to me, that map was really clear, but I had to laugh when I was listening to the county, or maybe it was the developer attorney, say, oh, no, no, no. That area that's not designated means you could do whatever you want. You can build whatever you want. This is my layman's hearing of what they were saying. And I thought, oh, so that means you can just put a high rise in this area. That means you can put 5 hospitals next to each other. I mean, anything goes. I was pretty stunned that that was the argument. That's just my take.
Well, we think you're right.
Okay.
There's two ways to interpret that 1983 ordinance.
Mm,
And remember, it was implementing the 1981 comprehensive plan that said we're
no
prohibiting
more.
any increases in development. And
Hmm.
so when that comprehensive plan said that in 1981, at the most, you could build 36 hotel rooms an acre on Siesta Key. So now you come in and you can either interpret the ordinance that implemented that plan to lift that 36 unit an acre limit, and now it's unlimited, or you could read the comprehensive plan that says we're concerned about evacuation and coastal resources, and we're not going to allow more development than we ever allowed before. You could read that to say we're not going to allow any
Yeah.
new hotel or motel development on
It's
Siesta Key. I mean, I think that's the only way to logically interpret the
mhm.
comprehensive plan. Now immediately, the listener might say, well, isn't the developer or the people who are arguing for the county today, aren't they right that doesn't it make sense to put hotels on beaches where tourists are going to want to go?
Mm,
And there's two responses to that. Number one, uh, the comprehensive plan had very good reasons to say we do not want dense hotels on barrier islands for all these public safety and environmental reasons.
mhm,
Number two, uh, there are lots of other places for tourists to stay.
mhm,
In fact, Siesta Key, where there has not been a hotel built under the 1989 comprehensive plan,
mhm,
Siesta Key has, for the last couple of years running, been the number one contributor of bed taxes in,
mm,
in, in Sarasota County. So
mhm.
tourists are staying in condos, they're staying in
Yeah.
vacation rentals. Okay, so there are plenty of places for tourists to stay who want to stay on the beach.
Yeah.
But under the comprehensive plan, as written, the policy approach, totally consistent with state law, was
Mhm,
taken that the hurricane evacuation, the storm surge, the coastal resource problems with big, tall dense hotel rooms is a problem. And we
yeah.
can't, allow that. It's part of the carrying capacity analysis.
Yeah.
It was a policy decision that said you can have too many people for hurricane evacuation or coastal resources and just general overcrowding and quality of life in an area like Siesta Key. There
Yeah.
have to be some limits. It can't be off limits. And the last thing I'll say on that point is under Florida law, under Sarasota County Comprehensive Plan, barrier islands are the least favorable place to have intensive hotel development, not the most favorable place.
No,
And
and let
that's
me just
certainly
jump
where
in for a second because you've talked about this 36 units an acre, 36 units an acre. That was the line in the sand. Haven't had new hotels. Siesta Key has thrived. It's crowded enough. Most people find it difficult to get there during season. Um, People who live here, who pay taxes to maintain the beach and all of that. But the jump, what the county approved, how many units an acre when you come to hotel rooms? It's not 36. Is it 175? What's the number that they?
now the number based on the allowance that they've granted for the first hotel they approved, the number is now 177 hotel rooms per acre that you
Yeah.
could build
So
on
we're
Siesta
not
Key.
we're not talking about nitpicking a few rooms. This is a massive increase. I
It
mean,
was an off the charts massive increase
yeah,
in the number of rooms, which, as far as we've been able to tell, that's a higher density of hotel rooms than you'll find, near Disney World, an
really.
International Drive. That's a higher
Wow.
density than you see on hotel rooms built before growth management laws on Miami Beach.
Mm,
It
okay.
is it is a it's a monstrous number of hotel rooms,
Hmm.
in a coast that has very concerning hurricane evacuation constraints, which, by the
Okay.
way, the roads on and off Siesta Key are physically constrained, meaning there's no room to widen them. You can't
No,
build more capacity to get people off the islands
because you've
faster.
got the bridge, the North Bridge, the South Bridge. Yeah.
Right. And so it's just that
Okay.
it's a refusal to respect the finite limits of land that we have in Florida in general, and in this case, in Siesta Key in particular. And it continues to reflect sort of the age old, pretty well defunct theory that more is always better.
Hmm.
We are everywhere in Florida, certainly every coastal area in Florida, are now struggling with how we are going to protect multi-billions worth of existing infrastructure and investment on our coastal areas in Florida, how we are going to protect the safety of people who live here, permanent residents and people who are visiting, tourists.
Yeah.
And so, to pretend we are still at the dawn of the industrial age, and to use
Mm.
this old outdated economic model that more is always better, and to pretend
No.
that we are not subject to rapidly rising sea levels, higher storm surge, more intense, more frequent hurricanes. I mean, these are just realities
Hmm.
that we either come to terms with and start planning for them,
Yeah.
or we just say, you know what, them who are in a position to make a lot of money until the day of reckoning comes, we're just going to keep doing that. And then when the day of reckoning comes, it'll be on somebody else's watch, somebody else's problem.
Hmm.
Now that seems, that's where your discussion earlier of short-term versus long-term thinking comes into play. That's ruinous. That's a ruinous policy.
Yeah, it is
And
ruinous. Just to get to your point about the carrying capacity. It's not just the land itself, but I'm a graduate of the University of Virginia, and in the medical school there, they did a study of EMT response times. So ambulances getting to, in a sprawl environments. We're not even talking about a barrier island here. We're just talking about auto-centric, auto-dependent type of development, not walkable development, and its impact on an ambulance getting to a patient, right, in need on time. And there was a significant impact. And so quite literally, it can be a life or death situation, not just when it comes to an evacuation, but you living on Barrier Island, you're having a heart attack, you need an ambulance. It's high season, it's President's Day. Um, that ambulance may have a lot of trouble getting over that bridge to get you. Why? In my view, because a few people, you've got politicians who can't bring themselves to say no, an appropriate no, to people who just want to stack up hotel rooms, and regardless of the impact. Is that something that figures into your calculus?
well, very, very, very much so. I'm often struck by the disconnect between, advertisements and rhetoric and speeches that I see where we are welcoming any and all new development and new growth, and we want all these people to come to Florida and enjoy the lifestyle here. But the moment you make that move, and now you're an existing resident and you're living
Mhm.
here,
Mhm.
we don't care very much about your quality of life
Mhm.
anymore. You know,
Mhm.
we worry about you, we care about you when we're trying to lure you to come down. But once you're here, then uh, development that increases how long it takes ambulances to get to your house. I'm
Mhm.
so sorry. The beat
Yeah.
must go on. Development that completely changes the nature and the character of that neighborhood, that community that you've now invested into. So sad. You know, you can't stop progress.
I gotta tell you,
So
I live at the base of the Ringling Bridge, which, so during high season, there's just a steady influx of cars coming from Lido Key and Longboat Key. So this is just north of Siesta. I had a friend who told me she would get a phone call from this friend on Longboat Key asking her, "Can you look out your window and tell me what's going on over the bridge?" You know, because I don't know if I want to go to the grocery store now or, later. And likewise, it'd be great to see a study of how many people move off the key once, and mainly I'm thinking Longboat, but Siesta too. Um, because they're having to go to doctor's appointments more frequently. Like there's a way that people buy on the barrier islands and think this is going to be my final home. But then the reality of living there, especially when they become older and they really need to be able to access physicians and all that, they move off. They don't stay there.
right, and so it's a question of whether you think that that's a good thing or a bad thing. You know, there are
Yeah,
some for whom, well, there will always be somebody else to come and buy
that's
their place, so we're good with that. But if we're actually in this to protect and maintain the quality of life of people who've lived here a long time or people who are just living here, then we have to do things differently, and you have to take those kinds of things into consideration, and they are real, and they are impacts, and they are often impacts that really outweigh the benefits of just a continued building. And for example, um, the cleanup costs after hurricanes, the government tax dollars play a huge role in cleanup costs when it comes to cleaning up after the devastation of a Hurricane Ian, for example.
sure.
Um, but yet, when we're approving new development on hurricane prone areas like a barrier island, that's never part of the discussion. The
Yeah.
liability for existing taxpayers that comes with that shiny new development. The focus tends to be, oh, well, it'll bring in, some more jobs and some tax revenue, but we don't want to talk about the potential downside of the liability that it brings, both short and long term,
Yeah,
be it
the
emergency
FEMA fairy
services.
will come.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody, if you've just joined me, you are listening to Detail on WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota, Florida, and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton, Florida. For 30 years, Legal Aid of Minnesota, with offices in Sarasota, Bradenton, and Venice, has provided free civil legal help for their low-income neighbors in Sarasota and Manatee County by partnering with local lawyers. These are challenging times. If you're facing an emergency with issues like evictions, domestic violence, reemployment, or loss of benefits, Legal Aid of Minnesota is there to help. Information about qualification can be found online at legalaidminnesota.org and by phone at 941-366-0038. And with me today is Richard Grosso. He is an attorney representing two plaintiffs, Lourdes Ramirez and Mike Hutchinson, I believe Mr. Hutchinson's wife, whose name escapes me, regarding development decisions in Sarasota County. So we've been talking about the mega hotel approval going from 36 rooms an acre to 177 rooms an acre on Siesta Key, which seems to be a violation of the Sarasota County Comprehensive Plan. That's one issue that Ms. Ramirez is suing over. But out east of I-75, Mr. Hutchinson, and there's a group called Keep the Country Country, have been working for a number of years now to keep overdevelopment at bay in our rural area. And so, Richard Grosso, in the Sarasota Comprehensive Plan, it's clear that we're to provide different lifestyles. One of them is a rural lifestyle. I think there are a lot of people aware of the need for local food, sound nutrition, whether we're raising livestock in our rural lands or we're growing produce in our rural lands. And there are people like me who live in the cities who like to be able to go out there and go do a honey tasting, right, at Crowley Nature Center. Um, Visit the dairy farm, Dakin Dairy Farm out there. I don't want to see those areas disappear. But it feels like that's what we're facing. Can you give us an idea of what's going on east of I-75 and how this great plan we had, the 2050 plan, appears to have been dismantled and now it's like anything goes? What's
Sure.
happening?
So I am working with Mike Hutchinson and his wife Eileen Fitzgerald
Eileen
as
good
my
Irish
clients
name.
in that case. And this, so you're so right that the county went through a process of enacting a 2050 comprehensive plan that is as detailed and nuanced and surgical and balanced of an approach to allow some development in rural areas as I've ever seen. And I've done a lot of land use
Oh,
work
it won
throughout Florida.
awards. It won
And
awards. Yeah.
and you know, and it was it did a great job of balancing property rights and the ability, the desire for some people to live in these suburbs and these open areas with the need to protect the fast diminishing, rural agricultural way of life in Sarasota County. And then, practically before the ink is dry on that very thoughtful, detailed plan, a developer decides I want to do a project and it's not what's allowed in those
Mhm.
areas. So I want you to carve me out my own special set of rules. And that's what
Mhm.
happened with
Mhm.
this project. The county came in after having gone through this really detailed, thoughtful planning process. And because a developer said, I don't like that, I don't want to do that, they rewrote the plan special for that development.
Can
And
I share a quick story with you? You might not have
of course,
okay. When I ran for county commission, I came in looking at a fiscally concerning issue. It didn't have anything to do with land use. So I was still learning. I'd been a realtor in the state of Virginia, and I saw a decision that really concerned me, and it was basically awarding Schrader Manatee Ranch development rights that they had given up. But what happened, I think in 2003, the 2050 plan was enacted. And within 6 months, Rex Jensen, who was the chairman of Schrader Manatee Ranch, was complaining that it didn't work. He had actually been paid $7 million to retire development rights. It was 2,500 dwellings, 2,500 for preserving Gum Slough, which was way east in Sarasota County. So Schrader Manatee Ranch got $7 million from the Environmentally Sensitive Lands Protection Program here in Sarasota County. We tax ourselves and we conserve land locally through the government. So he wasn't going to build anymore. And he started complaining. And a county commissioner told him, look, you can have the money or you can have the development rights, but you can't have both. And to me, it just speaks to the long game where you've got developers active in politics. In 2010, they gave him both. They awarded all those development rights back to Schrader Manatee Ranch. They called them open space credits. They just rechristened them a different name. And the citizens of Sarasota County paid $7 million basically for nothing. We just didn't get anything for it. And because it happened over a 6-year period of time, most people didn't even know it was happening. So that's like, yeah.
I don't know anything about that particular project, but
Mhm.
it is certainly a common practice to grant approvals under certain conditions and then to tout that that's what we've done. That's what makes it a good project.
Mm-hmm.
And these bigger, larger projects take many years to build out.
Yeah.
And then over that time,
People
those
forget.
changes get made
Mm-hmm.
to the requirements or
Mm-hmm.
conditions, and that's no longer page one. That doesn't make the cut at all, in terms of
Yeah.
any media attention. So it is not it's a common mode
Mm-hmm.
of operation. Um, but the current project, the current problem out east are that you drive out Fruitville Road now, and you already are seeing the problems associated with some of the prior past bad development decisions. Uh, as you drive all the way out towards the end of the county, the eastern border of the county out there in the Mayaca area,
Mm-hmm.
you see farms, several odd miles worth of farms in rural lands, and now here's a subdivision, and now a few more miles of farms and rural area, and oh, there's another subdivision. Florida law was written to stop that. Florida law was written to require there to be a separation, a clear separation.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the center cities, here's the suburban areas, and now here's the farms.
Mm-hmm.
Because once you start dotting your rural areas with suburbs, now you get to justify, well, just filling in the dots.
Yeah. Well,
Now
it's
there's
highly
always
inefficient, isn't it, when it comes to infrastructure?
this really smart point. Part of the reason we do that, or a big part, is to protect farming and farm products and a rural way of life. But the other key reason is that it's way more expensive to
Mm-hmm.
get infrastructure out there.
Mm-hmm.
And not just, the sewer and water lines and the roads, which are in government doesn't do anything that's more expensive than build and maintain roads,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and typically, even where a developer will put up the money up front to build a road, it then is turned over to the public to maintain it for the rest of its useful life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fire, and it's police, it's emergency services, the kinds of things you were talking about. So in
Yeah.
long term, those anti-urban sprawl rules are designed to protect the public budgets.
Yeah.
And that's but once we start approving one project out there, then the next one comes in, and what's the first thing they're arguing? Well, there's already a
Did it
project
here.
out here.
Mm-hmm.
We've already begun to change it from a rural area to a suburb, and I'm now consistent with that last suburb that you approved. And so it just feeds on itself, and it's death by a thousand cuts of a way of life that's vanishing all too much. And the other point you made that a lot of people don't understand is it's a really inefficient use of land.
Yeah.
I can recall, I don't know who it is, but at least one local leader, when voting to approve of this project, um, justified it on the basis that we've got a lot of population growth in the United States of America,
Mm.
as though it were somehow Sarasota County's responsibility
To
to
provide for the.
provide for all of
Mhm.
that. But you know what? Another reason why the land use laws prevent urban sprawl and encourage more dense development in the places it's located is 30, 40 years from now, this area may
Mhm.
very well be needed
Yeah.
to house X number of people for population growth, but
Mm-hmm.
it will have already been developed at really inefficient 1 unit per acre development,
Yeah.
where you're not putting enough people on an acre of land to make it an efficient use of land. You're using too much land to
Yeah.
house too small of a population.
Yeah.
So,
There was a
again,
great study, just to piggyback on your point, in 2010. Sarasota County was the subject, and I love this guy's work. His name is Joe Minicozy. He's a founder of a firm called Urban 3, and they were instrumental in reviving downtown Asheville, North Carolina. But what he did was he developed a new metric called tax yield per acre. And this speaks to in the Sarasota County Comprehensive Plan. And it was a groundbreaking idea, it still is, that we want new development to be fiscally neutral. So that means that it pays for itself. And what he did was he looked at all the different forms of development in Sarasota County, and this speaks to our efficiency discussion. These single family homes in Sarasota County, the sprawl development, meaning auto-centric, you can't walk to the grocery store, you got to get in your car to do anything. It takes 80 years for the tax revenue from that house to pay for the infrastructure it requires, which is longer than the life of the infrastructure. Another leading thinker in land use development is Charles Marone. He's a civil engineer. And he says, it'll never pay for itself. He calls it a Ponzi scheme, right? And Florida is kind of at the forefront of this Ponzi scheme that, we think because it's shiny and new, it's going to bring in more money. Well, it does for the first 8 years. But once you have to start fixing things and once you have to start maintaining things, you're upside down. It doesn't generate enough tax revenue to pay for the services it requires. It's actually the cities that typically are more of a donor tax base, they kind of take care of. And the true rural areas are self-sufficient financially too. But this in-between zone is where we really get in trouble because it's not financially solvent. How about that piece of the Sarasota comprehensive plan speaking to fiscal neutrality? Does that play any role in your case here, or have you seen that in other counties in Florida?
Yes, it's a pretty common policy to have in a land use plan, but the problem comes down to the complexity of how you count, what you count on both sides of the ledger,
Yeah.
and how you do your math. There's such a complex web of financial transactions that take place over the life from initial approval to fixing potholes, like you were talking about.
Forever.
That,
Yeah.
that you have lots of leeway as to how you define what constitutes fiscal neutrality. A lot of leeway to what you look at and what you pretend to not look at. And so, the devil is in the details there, and it's how
Yes.
rigorous the job you're doing of looking at all the public costs long term. You can come up with any predetermined outcome you want based on how you write the model, the economic formula or whatever, and that's where it comes down to.
Yeah, that it is a tough one. Well, I think most people, and while we were preparing to get started recording, I had mentioned to you, getting back to this idea about carrying capacity, that in Sarasota County, Justin Bloom with Suncoast Waterkeepers brought suit to enforce the Clean Water Act against Sarasota County because over the course of like 8 years, 7 years, it was 2013 to like 2020 maybe, Sarasota County had been allowing treated effluent in its wastewater facility east of I-75 to spill. I mean, it just fell over the edges of these tanks to spill into Philippi Creek Basin. It wasn't an accident. I don't like the word spill because it implies an accident. This was just a decision to allow the water to be contaminated. And he estimated it was nearly 1 billion gallons over these years that had been constantly infiltrating the waterways. So much so, it's filled with nitrogen and phosphorus. We had horrible red tide in the summer of 2018 here. Some restaurants closed. Summer's a tough time anyway, but I saw, fish floating by, just big, I don't know what schools of dead fish floating by. Can you speak to how that rural area or low development on the barrier islands can kind of tamp down the challenges we face there?
Well, there's one of the reasons that Florida law tries to limit suburbia encroaching into farm and rural areas is because it just makes it, with every, hundreds or 1,000 acre new development, you're now replacing a rural use of farming use with a suburban use, where now instead of people engaging in the same type of activity that I'm engaging in, they're now people who are complaining about manure smells and complaining about, how slow that tractor or other equipment is on a shared road. It just makes it harder and harder for farmers to do their thing when suburbs keep encroaching on them. The the support businesses that sell feed and machinery and take care of animals, as their customer and client base dwindles, because I'm replacing farming and rural uses with suburban uses, then you're starting to lose that component of the industry out there. And so there is, yes, a carrying capacity, a finite amount of land that you need in order to protect that way of life. I mean, at some point, and it's not just the economics of the farming or whatever, this is not the same place that I moved to. This is not the same place that I've invested in and lived 30 years, that I wanted to raise my children in this kind of place. In Florida, we are fast paving over these very unique, special areas of Florida to create another suburb that looks just like the other suburb, where I plop myself down in there, and I don't know if I'm in Sarasota County versus Dade County versus Leon County anymore, because it looks, that strip mall, that suburb looks just like the other one in another place. So we're becoming, the state that is named for its wildflowers, Florida, that is this incredible, one of the most incredible ecosystems as a state on Earth. And we are just trying to make it look like every other place, and pave over what made it special, in the beginning, be those, farmlands or coastal barrier islands, or, sinks and aquifers, sinkholes and rivers, just all these things that made Florida special. We are just going to pave right over them and right up next to them and pretend that they're going to still be able to function and be the Florida that we all thought we were making our homes in. And that's just not realistic to keep doing that.
Respecting the land requires something more. I was doing some research for this show and came across an article regarding what was happening on the East Coast of Florida. And the headline basically said the maxing out and bulging at the seams, the gridlock, that's happening on the roads above ground. They said it's happening underground too. That, that our wastewater treatment reflects the same kind of problems that we're seeing with traffic. I thought it was a very potent analogy. And that, in that article, they said the American Society of Civil Engineers gives Florida a D when it comes to stormwater management and a C when it comes to wastewater management. And actually, one gentleman in the article said, he moved to Sarasota away from the East Coast because he thought it was better here. And I'm like, well, it might be better now. I hope it stays better, but I don't know. Just some final thoughts, because we have a few minutes left. Richard, what can people do, number one, to make this better, And then number two, are you seeing any reason for hope when it comes to elected officials? Just generally speaking, is there the tide turning at all, or is it just pretty tough out there when it comes to our elected officials in the state?
I'll end on a high note, on a positive thing,
Okay.
but I'll start with, if I'm going to be honest with you, the tide turn that I have been seeing is going in the wrong direction.
Okay.
I think that when you look at the local government, county, city decisions, not just Sarasota County, but throughout the state, places I work in, they've actually gotten worse in the last few years. I think that you're seeing a combination of, every place has its own different pressure points. And in Southeast Florida, there's a lot of money trying to find a place to sit from coming in from some other places, and it's buying up land, and it's buying up condos, and it's buying up homes, and it's creating a need for affordable housing that then fuels that additional new project that we must approve because it's going to help make housing more affordable. As we run out of land, as we run up against that finite amount of land and water, obviously it drives the value of land up, and it creates even more pressure for that new project in whatever area that's going to be. So the pressures, continued population growth, the pressures have only been increasing, and the amount of money at stake has only been increasing. And so from my perch, I think I'm seeing probably worse governmental decision making at the local government level than I've seen in my career. Now, what can people do? You can prioritize these issues when you're deciding who to vote for.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the environment and the quality of my life on a daily basis, my traffic, whatever, that tends not to be in the top like 3 of voter concerns when people decide who they're going to vote for, because they just don't, it's not made that list. They don't even realize how it's affecting them on a daily basis. And so changing the priorities you put on issues and the expectations you put on people who want your vote, and beginning to insist that people who are running for county commission and city council demonstrate an understanding of the importance of smart land use planning and environmental protection. When that starts to occur, and that is the dominant theme of campaigns, things would change for the better. And the same comes for your state legislators.
Yeah.
State legislature decides what the land use planning laws say the local governments have to comply with. And I don't think anyone who has watched these issues over the last 20 years would say that the Florida legislature has shown itself to, frankly, to be up to the task of managing growth in a smart way for the state of Florida. So prioritizing the state elected officials who care and understand about land use planning and the long-term value to our state, that's the only thing. Those things will change the dynamic. They're the only things that will change the dynamic. But the positive thing that I've seen in Florida is, at the same time where you might observe that you don't think the candidates we're electing are necessarily those who prioritize the environment. Over the last several years, I can only think of one local initiative to spend tax dollars to buy environmentally sensitive land that has not passed.
Yeah, there's
Land
the way people get it. Yeah.
Land acquisition initiatives around the state almost always pass overwhelmingly. People do care about protecting natural areas that are part of their life. And
Richard, I have to end. I could talk about this for hours with you. I so appreciate your work, Richard Grosso. Everybody, you have been listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota, Florida, and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton, Florida. For 30 years, Legal Aid of Minnesota, with offices in Sarasota, Bradenton, and Venice, has provided free civil legal help for their low-income neighbors in Sarasota and Manatee County by partnering with local lawyers. These are challenging times. If you're facing an emergency with issues like evictions, domestic violence, reemployment, or loss of benefits, Legal Aid of Minnesota is there to help. Information about qualification can be found online at legalaidminnesota.org or by phone at 941-366-0038. Thank you all so much for listening. Be sure to stay tuned for more Public Affairs programming here on WSLR. And Richard, thank you once again for joining me.
Had a great time talking to y'all.
Thank you.